Welcome everybody, I'm John Walley, and today we're going to be talking about hiding and removing assets in Tenable OT. Now, before we jump into the technical part, we should spend a little bit of time talking about what's the difference between these. It seems pretty obvious. One, I'm hiding something so I don't see it, and one, I'm removing it from the system. But it's not quite that simple. So let's talk about hiding first. So whenever I have an asset that shows up in my inventory and I don't necessarily want to see it, or I don't want it to count against my license, I also don't want the system to rediscover it in the future, then I would use this hiding function. This would allow me to hide it from the interface. I'd no longer track the vulnerabilities against it. It would no longer track in my licensing, so it would reduce that asset for licensing, and it will never try to discover that asset again. Where removing an asset removes it temporarily while it makes the license go down for a few minutes. If that asset ever shows up again, it will be put back into your inventory. There's very different reasons why we'd use these two different kind of tools to our advantage when we're talking about hiding or removing assets. So hiding assets is if you put something in there, it's for a subnet that you don't want to track, and you don't want it to ever rediscover either. Now, there's some ways that we can work with this when we're talking about assets, but one of the easy ways to do this is just to hide the asset. That way, if it ever shows up again, we're good. Now, I'm not a big fan of hiding assets, and I'll talk about why as we go through this video, but I typically don't like to hide them. I like to fix the rules that are discovered them to begin with, and then removing them so that they're not rediscovered. So that brings us into removing. There's a lot of different ways we can remove assets. We can hide assets, and then we can remove everything that's hidden, which is something I recommend. We can remove the asset by subnet. Let's say we've moved something or segmented something out. We can remove that subnet, or we can remove asset by asset. So let's go ahead and log in and see what this looks like. Now I'm going to go ahead and log in locally. You can do this if you're on an Active Directory login as well. That's fine. All right, and we're going to go look at a few of our assets. So I'm going to go to inventory, and I'm going to go to all assets. And let's start playing first by just looking at subnets. So if you're not familiar with how to filter and how to move around, you can go to one of my previous videos on OT where we cover this. If we look up at the IP area, I'm going to filter. I'm going to go to a list, and I'm going to filter on a very specific IP range. So I'm going to say 192.168.136 as an example. We'll do .0/24, and I'm going to hit apply here. And you'll see we have 4 devices in here. And let's say I've segmented this out. I'm going to actually change this a little bit just to show you how the CIDR notation works. If I say 0.0, and I change this to a 16, it looks like I've picked up a few more. So when you're searching and filtering for your IP addresses, you can use entire networks, and you can use CIDR notation to filter through those. So now we have a handful of devices that are out there that we've filtered on. I'm going to go ahead and select all of these devices. And I'm going to go in and say that I want the bulk action. I want to hide these devices. I'm going to say why, and I'm going to say for removal. Now, this may be something that is not for removal if this is what you're doing. This is just so that you can see how we can remove these later on in the video. This may be you're hiding them because you're not interested in finding vulnerabilities on these assets. Or it may be because you don't necessarily want to track the license temporarily until you can update it. So not only can you hide stuff, but you can unhide it, and we'll be talking about that in a few minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and say hide. And now all of my systems that I had selected are hidden. So now they're no longer in here. If I go back and I unfilter to any and I apply, I will not have any of those original 192.168.0.0 addresses in here any longer. They've been removed from my inventory. If I go down to my local settings and I look at my environmental configuration, I can go to hidden assets. And here I will see all the different assets that I removed as I went through and I did that. And you'll see that I have some 192.168.8s, have some 192.168.136s, some 3.3s. So we've removed several subnets here. You'll also see that we have a comment in here so you can see why any particular one was removed, and you can go through and you can filter on those if you're gonna like remove some, go through and work through a process if you start working with your assets. Again, your license count will also go down when you do this. So that's the first piece. This is removal. It's pretty straightforward. The main reason that people use these is to reduce their license count temporarily. And that's the only reason I would really use hidden assets. And I would never put an asset that you actually care about the vulnerabilities or events that are happening on that asset, because they'll no longer be tracked. And that could end up bringing a lot of danger into your environment. But it is worth bringing them in and hiding them first and removing them later on so that they'll relearn. Let's say that we've modified our system, we've changed a lot of policies, or we had our subnet set up in a certain way, then we may not want to remove them until we've got everything set up. We hide them so it doesn't continue learning. We do our configuration changes, we upgrade our license or whatever it is, and then we can go in and let the system start relearning those assets again. So that's all about hiding assets. Now, above and beyond just hiding assets, we can go into asset removal. And so asset removal is going to take a little more work, and it's something that we need to do on the command line side. So I'm going to jump over to our cockpit or port 8000, and I'm going to log in here. I'm going to make sure that my administrative access is turned on. And I'm going to go down to my terminal. Now, the first thing I want to do is get into the actual folder where all of my tools are. So I'm going to change directories to opt, and then Indigy, tools, and I'll have several tools in this library or this folder that I can use for removing assets. So if we take a look at this, I have a regular asset remover. And then if we go down a little more, I have a hidden assets remover. And then if we go down, I have a multi-asset remover. And then I have a subnet remover. So I have all these different types of remover tools for removing assets that I have in here. So why don't we start at the very beginning of this, is I'm going to go over and I'm going to look at how I can remove some of these by subnet. So if I go back over and I start looking at some of my all assets, and let's say I want a very specific subnet that I'm looking for. So let's say I'm looking for an IP range of 10.100.101.0/24. See if we have any of those in there. Excellent. We have 26 items here. And let's say I want to remove these. And what you'll learn is it'll start, after we remove them, it'll start learning them back again. And that's the difference between removal. Now I could go in and change my system so that I no longer captured these. So if I go into my asset settings, you'll see that I have this 10.100.0.0-16. What I could do is break out all of these individual 100 networks so that I've removed my current 101, and then I no longer remember, no longer relearn those assets. And that's what I would recommend in a situation like this. If you really don't want to monitor that asset, I would hide it temporarily, go in, fix your IP ranges for your monitored networks. Once that's updated, I would go in and remove it. One of the ways that we can remove that is through command line. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say sudo, because we need to be a super user on here. And then we want to put in the command that we have here. So we're going to put a dot and a slash so that we know where we're going. And we're going to say subnet remover. And then I'm going to tell it what subnet. So I'm going to say 10.100.101.0/24. I'm going to hit return. It's going to ask me for a password. And it's going to ask me, am I sure that I want to remove everything from that subnet? I'm going to say yes and hit return. It's going to go through some work. It's going to stop our system. It's going to start and stop Postgres. It's going to make those actual changes within the database, and then it's going to bring the system back up. We'll fast forward through this and we'll come back as soon as this is done. All right, it looks like we're done here. Now, the other thing we could do is if we were to go through and count these, there would probably be 26 here. So that's each one of them. I'm going to bring your attention to this ID that's out here. This is that assets ID. So what this script has done is it's gone out, it's looked at everything that has that IP address range, it's identified each one of the unique identifiers for that asset, and then it removed that asset and it went in and restarted the system. So let's go back to our system now. We'll refresh. We're going to have to log back in. If we go and we look at our inventory, if we're fast enough, you'll see the system is already relearning. But if you look and see what it says when it first discovered in the last update, you'll see that we have a May 7th date now. So it removed everything, but then it came in and started learning that system all over. So even though it discovered it today, those systems that you remove will come back if you don't go into your settings and remove them from your asset range. So this is important. Otherwise, you just want to hide them, and that will keep them gone for a long time. So let's go look at that. So we hit all of those are gone, but what if we actually wanted to hide them as well? So remember, we went down to our local settings, we went to our environment, and we said, what are our hidden assets? And we had them all in this 192 range. But what happens if I remove these? So I'm going to go back over to my terminal. I'm going to clear the screen up. And we'll take a look at our tools again. And we'll see the next option that we'll have here is this remover for just any of the hidden tools. So I'm going to sudo /hidden asset remover. And all I have to do is hit return here. I don't have to say anything else because I already know what assets I have to remove. I'm going to hit enter. And it said, hey, here's the assets we found. Are you sure you want to do this? We're going to say yes. And then we're going to remove those hidden assets. All right, and it looks like we found all of our assets. We've removed them, and the system's coming back up. So let's go back over to our interface, and we're going to have to log in again. So we're going to refresh here. We'll log in locally. And now you'll see we no longer have any hidden assets. Well, what happened to them? I thought we hid them. Well, we did, but we removed them. So if we remove a hidden asset, then that removes it from the hidden list as well. So if we go to our inventory, we go to all assets, and we change our filter to our 192.168 that we had previously, you'll see it's starting to learn these assets again. So if you want them to remain hidden, if you want them to remain gone from your system, you want to keep them in hidden and not remove them. Now, like I said, the real way to do this is to go into your system settings and actually remove that area from the assets that you're tracking. But sometimes it can be difficult, especially if they're in the middle of a major subnet and you're having to remove one or two assets. Then it's just better to go ahead and remove them individually, hide them individually, and let them be in the system. But I would not do whole subnets like what you've seen us doing. All right, so that takes us to the kind of the final thing that we're going to be talking about and how to remove assets, and that's by an individual asset. And the way we can do that is by ID. And this isn't something we've talked about before. So I'm going to go to all assets. I'm going to remove our filter here and say any. Now we have all of our different assets in here. And I want to remove a single asset. And we saw previously when we did both of our removals, it came up with these asset IDs. And to remove an asset, I need to know the asset ID. So how do I figure that out? If I look here and I click anywhere within a specific asset, and I'm going to change this by risk score, kind of play around with this a little bit. And so if I look at, let's say, this Olympia, that's fine. We'll look at this one. Where in the world can I find this asset ID? If I look through here, if I search for it, if I go in and look at the screen and say something like ID, you'll see that I have a manufacturer ID, a profile ID, and OEM ID, but I really don't have an ID for the device. So where do I find this? So there's a tricky kind of way of finding the ID from the very beginning from a single asset if I'm in the asset. If I go up to the URL, you'll actually see it in here where it says ID equals, and I could literally just copy that right there and look up that ID. So this is one way of doing it. If I don't want to do it that way, I can go over to my settings where I do all the view of each one of my tables, and I can select the check mark for ID. What you'll see is it'll bring up each ID of each device of each one of these. So you'll see that this ID is ends with this 9F8. If I look in here, you'll see the same ID here with a 9F8. So this will give you the same number, the same ID either way. So now that we have our ID, I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I could have copied it from the other one as well. I'm going to go back in. Let's clear this up. Do an ls for our tools, and we're going to use our asset remover. So I'm going to sudo do my asset remover, and I'm going to copy and paste the actual asset ID. I'm going to hit enter. It's going to ask me for my password. It'll ask me, am I sure that I will remove this? And you'll see that it's removing from this backplane, and it found the IP address of that. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to hit enter. It's going to stop my system, remove it from the database, and bring everything back up. Now remember, by the time we get there, it'll probably be back there and it's relearned it again, but it'll be from today because it removed it from the system completely and allowed it to relearn. So when would I use these removals, and why would I do that? Well, maybe I want to remove that asset group, like I said, because I've segmented my network and I no longer want to track that, and there shouldn't be anything in there. So I've removed it for that reason. Maybe I've been having problems with an asset, and I've seen this before. Like if a lot of times Tenable OT will identify an asset the wrong way, especially if I have something going on like proxy ARP. And we haven't talked a lot about proxy ARP, but it has a lot to do with how information gets through a firewall. And so a lot of times what will happen is you'll get assets on the back plane of another controller that aren't really there. To give you an idea, I've actually seen a Windows engineering workstation on the back plane of a PLC. And it starts getting really wonky, and you can go in and fix that, but that's not going to fix that asset. So a lot of times removing an individual asset so it can relearn is good, because it'll relearn with the correction in place, and then it'll be valid information for that individual asset. So I know this is a little bit shorter video. People have been asking for some shorter clips on just very specific things like adding and removing assets. Hopefully this has been helpful. If it is, please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see each video as it comes out. Thank you and have a great day.